The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial started like every other night shift for Katie Rodriguez. She arrived at 2,100 hours through the staff entrance, badge already in hand, eyes down. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar mechanical song above rows of empty gurneys, the antiseptic smell sharp enough to coat the back of her throat. She moved through the ER with a kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory, 18 months of the same route, the same rhythm, the same invisible presence in a white coat that nobody remembered 5 minutes after she left the room. Her scrubs were navy blue, practical, the kind that didn't stand out. Her dark hair was pulled back tight enough to smooth the lines from her forehead, a style that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with not giving anyone a reason to look twice. She had a slight limp in her right leg, the kind that flared up during double shifts, but she'd learned to move in ways that made it almost invisible. Most people didn't notice. The ones who did never asked. Katie moved to her locker in the break room and opened it with a combination she'd chosen the day her discharge papers were signed, 02-09. February 2009. The faded unit patch inside her jacket lining caught her eye as she hung it on the hook. Just a patch. Just fabric. Just something she couldn't bring herself to throw away even though she'd tried, multiple times, to move on from who she used to be. She ran her thumb across it once, a habit that had become ritual, then closed the locker and headed to the supply room. The trauma bays needed to be prepped. Bay 3 and Bay 4, the ones that stayed perpetually ready for the cases that would inevitably come through the doors. Katie worked in silence, her hands moving with precision that belonged to someone who had done this work under conditions far more severe than the calm of a Denver ER at night. She folded each corner of the linens with military corners, tight enough that a coin would bounce off them. She arranged the instrument trays in the exact sequence they would be needed, hemostats, clamps, scissors, gauze pads organized by size. The 14-gauge angiocath needles lined up in order. Everything accounted for. Everything within reach. Dr. Sterling walked past the trauma bays at 2,215 hours, his white coat moving like a flag ahead of him, his shoes clicking against the tile with the sound of someone who'd never questioned his place in any room. He glanced into Bay 3 where Katie was working, his eyes scanning the space with the kind of cursory attention a man gives to something he's already decided doesn't matter. He saw a quiet night shift nurse staying in her lane. He saw someone in her early 40s with a limp and salt in her dark hair and the kind of invisibility that came from asking for nothing. He didn't see anything that required his attention. Katie felt his presence, the way the air pressure changed when a man walked into a space convinced of his own importance. She didn't look up. She never looked up when Sterling was near. She'd learned, over 18 months, that avoiding his gaze was a kind of armor. Looking at him meant engaging. Engaging meant being visible. Being visible meant being remembered, and being remembered meant being asked questions she couldn't answer. Sterling paused to congratulate Nurse Melissa at the station on her 4 placement from earlier, a routine peripheral line, nothing remarkable. Melissa turned red, thanked him, smiled. This was the currency of the ER, a visible competence, visible deference, visible gratitude that someone important had noticed you existed. Katie understood the transaction. She just didn't participate in it anymore. The prep work continued in silence. Katie moved through the bays like a ghost moving through a familiar house, her hand steady, her breathing even, her mind already running through the scenarios that the night would inevitably bring. Trauma. Overdose. Chest pain. Sepsis. The usual choreography of human suffering that played out on the stages of hospitals every single night. She'd seen it all before. She'd seen it intense under mortar fire, under conditions that would have broken most people into pieces. The ER at Oak Creek Memorial was, by comparison, a place of relative peace. She arranged a bear hugger warming blanket across the stretcher in Bay 4, the way it would need to be when the next critical patient came through the doors. Her worn leather keychain sat on the supply shelf, nothing on it but a single key. No photographs. No personal markers. No evidence that she had a life outside these walls. In her pocket, hidden deep where nobody would ever think to look, was a challenge coin she'd kept from her Navy days. Not gold. Not polished. just a piece of worn metal with the insignia of naval special warfare stamped into it. She carried it the way other people carried photos of their families. The clock ticked toward 2,300 hours. The ER was quiet in that way that precedes something. Katie had learned, long ago, to recognize the feeling. It came in the minutes before everything changed. The air felt different. The light felt different. Patients weren't waiting to come through those doors. They were already on their way. Some ambulance was cutting through the Denver night, sirens wailing, someone's life pouring out of them in the back of a vehicle, heading toward these trauma bays where Katie stood, ready. The ER doors burst open at 0232 hours. The sound came first, the hydraulic hiss of the automatic doors, then the sharp slap of stretcher wheels against the floor tiles, then voices raised in the controlled urgency of paramedics transferring care. An ambulance crew wheeled in a single patient, a male, unconscious, bleeding through 3 layers of gauze at the right hip. The paramedic was calling out vitals in that practice monotone that came from delivering too many critical patients, male, approximately 35 to 40, found at industrial site with traumatic femoral laceration, BP 92/60 and dropping, heart rate 140, 2 large bore fours established, fluid running wide open, arrived on scene with no identification papers. Tactical uniform shredded in the area of injury, patient unconscious from blood loss, ETA to trauma surgery 5 minutes if we're moving. Katie moved toward the incoming stretcher before anyone else had fully processed the information. Her hands were already moving, checking pulse points on the neck, assessing airway, noting the specific way the fabric of the patient's uniform was torn. The patient wore combat gear. Not civilian clothing torn by accident. Military tactical wear. And as the paramedic wheeled the stretcher closer to Bay 3, something metallic caught the fluorescent light. Dog tags. Blood-soaked. Still hanging from a chain around the patient's neck. Katie's breath stopped. Her right hand reached out toward the tags almost without conscious decision, the way a hand reaches toward something it recognizes even in the dark. The unit insignia was still visible beneath the blood. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Her eyes closed for exactly half a second, not long enough for anyone to notice, not long enough to be weakness, just long enough to be human for a fraction of a moment that nobody was watching. Dr. Sterling entered the bay at the same moment, his presence announced by the sound of gloves snapping on his hands like gunshots. He was already taking command, already positioning himself as the authority in the space, already reaching for control the way a man reaches for a steering wheel. He barked orders at the attending resident. He demanded the monitor be brought closer. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged in any room, in any position, making any decision that affected someone else's life. Katie stepped back, her hand releasing the dog tags, her composure settling over her like a mask she'd learned to wear so well that she sometimes forgot it wasn't her real face. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. Deferential. The voice of someone asking permission rather than offering information. I can prep the rapid transfuser. Sterling barely glanced at her. He was already focused on the patient, on the monitors, on establishing his own narrative about what was happening in this space. He nodded without really acknowledging her, a gesture that meant go, a gesture that meant stay out of my way, a gesture that meant you are not important enough to require my actual attention. Katie moved to set up the level 1 rapid infuser, her hand steady, her eyes on the equipment, her mind doing the calculation that combat medicine had taught her years ago. Femoral artery laceration. BP dropping. Patient unconscious. For minutes. That was how long they had before this man's brain started dying from lack of oxygen. For minutes maximum before irreversible damage began. She worked in silence, each movement efficient, each action placed with the kind of precision that belonged to someone who'd worked under pressure so severe that a hospital ER felt like a peaceful day at work. The blood started flowing into the rapid infuser. O2 levels were being monitored. 2 units of type O negative went up on the hook above the stretcher. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that as Katie worked, and as Dr. Sterling worked in the adjacent bay with another critical patient, neither of them knew what the unconscious Army Ranger in Bay 3 would say when he woke up. Neither of them knew that the dog tags around his neck belonged to someone Sterling had never met and didn't know existed. Neither of them knew that the next 48 hours would end careers, expose secrets, and change everything about who Katie Rodriguez was supposed to be. The 4 lines were running. The monitor showed a heartbeat, weak but present. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of another ambulance siren was already cutting through the Denver night, heading toward Oak Creek Memorial, heading toward another crisis, heading toward the moment when everything Katie had built over 18 months of silence would collapse like a house built on sand. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the color of old bone. Katie's hands moved through the suturing without hesitation, her needle angle precise, a specific pattern designed for field hemorrhage control, the kind of stitching that holds under shrapnel and pressure. The femoral artery gaped like a mouth, dark blood pooling despite the pressure dressing. She'd given the patient local anesthesia only, there was no time for full sedation, no luxury for a slower approach. The clock inside her skull counted seconds the way it always did, blood loss at this rate, for minutes until cardiac arrest. The patient's eyes flickered open at minute 2. Morphine glazed and unfocused, then sharpening as consciousness clawed its way back. The Army Ranger watched his own chest as Katie worked, her hand steady as a surgical laser, the suture pattern tight and angled in a way that no civilian nurse should have known. His lips moved, dry and cracked, and his voice came out like gravel underfoot. "You were a medic." Katie didn't pause. The needle went in. The thread pulled taut. Another knot, another angle. "I've seen that stitch pattern in the sandbox," the Ranger whispered. "Muscle? Fallujah?" Katie's hands continued their precise dance. She didn't look at his face. "Baghdad. Stay still." That was all she said. One word, one location, one command. But something in the Ranger's eyes shifted, a recognition, the way a man looks when he's met someone who speaks his language without needing translation. He nodded once and closed his eyes again, trusting hands that clearly knew what they were doing. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway. She didn't see him at first, her entire world had narrowed to the surgical field, the bleeding vessel, the perfect angle of the suture. But he was there, watching the entire exchange, watching her hands, watching the Ranger's reaction. His expression moved through surprise to understanding to something that looked like hardening metal, the slow calcification of a man realizing his authority was being questioned by someone who wasn't supposed to question anything. Katie tied off the final suture. The bleeding stopped. She stepped back, released a breath she hadn't known she was holding, and only then did she sense him. Dr. Sterling stood framed in the doorway like a man who'd just watched his kingdom shift on its foundations. His jaw was tight. His eyes were flat. She looked away first. The next morning, the Ranger's family arrived during rounds. His wife came first, moving with the careful steps of a woman who'd learned to manage fear, her 2 young daughters beside her in clothes that suggested they'd dressed in the dark. A commanding officer in dress uniform followed, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, a man whose rank was visible in the way he moved through space. They gathered in the recovery room where the Ranger sat propped against pillows, color returning to his face, the worst of the crisis behind him. Dr. Sterling conducted rounds like a conductor leading an orchestra, speaking in the measured tones of authority, explaining vitals and medications and expected discharge timelines. Katie stood at the periphery taking vitals, her eyes on the monitor, her movements invisible. This was her place, the background, the supporting player, the woman who drew blood and documented numbers and stayed in her lane. Sterling stopped mid-sentence. He turned to face Katie, and his voice carried to the entire room, cutting through the quiet hum of the ventilator in the adjacent bay. "Nurse Rodriguez, your unauthorized arterial repair last night was reckless. You're a floor nurse, not a surgeon. What made you think you had the authority to perform advanced suturing without consulting the attending physician?" The room went dead silent. Katie took one measured breath. Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone trained to remain calm while everything burned. "Sir, the patient was bleeding out. The repair was." The repair was above your pay grade, clipboard Katie. Sterling cut her off with the precision of a scalpel, his tone dripping with contempt. The nickname hung in the air like smoke, a reduction, a diminishment, a public marking of inferiority. Not Catherine. Not Rodriguez. Clipboard Katie. Someone replaceable, someone who carried papers and followed orders and had no business making decisions. The ranger's wife exchanged a confused glance with her husband. The commanding officer frowned, his eyes narrowing in a way that suggested he was beginning to understand something was very wrong with this picture. Katie's right eye glistened. One tear escaped, traced a slow path down her left cheek. She didn't flinch from it. She didn't hide. She lifted her hand and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, and said, "Sir, that man would have bled out in 4 minutes. Was I supposed to page you and wait 6? Sterling's face flushed crimson. His jaw tightened until the muscles at his temples pulsed visibly. He'd expected her to shrink, to apologize, to accept the nickname and the public humiliation as her due. Instead, she'd made it personal. She'd asked a question that couldn't be answered without admitting he'd been wrong, and she'd done it in front of his patient's family and a commanding officer who was now staring at him with an expression that looked very much like judgment. "You're supposed to know your place," Sterling said quietly, and walked away. By noon, the write-up appeared on the unit board in the break room. It was printed on official hospital letterhead, the words formal and damning, unauthorized performance of advanced surgical procedures, failure to follow chain of command, potential credential discrepancies. Katie read it once, standing in front of the corkboard with a cup of coffee cooling in her other hand, her face revealing nothing. The words were carefully chosen, legally sufficient, designed to build a case rather than solve a problem. Sterling was playing a longer game now. The public humiliation had been the opening move. This was the consolidation. Katie sat down at her usual table at 1,400 hours with a sandwich she didn't want. 3 nurses approached the refrigerator at the far end of the room, women she'd worked beside for 14 months, women whose shifts she'd covered without complaint, women whose names were the closest thing she had to friendship in this place. They gathered their lunch trays. They exchanged glances that lasted exactly long enough to confirm understanding. Then they turned and walked past Katie's table without a word, without a pause, without the smallest acknowledgement of her existence. The room emptied. Katie sat alone under the fluorescent lights that buzzed like cicadas, the write-up visible on the corkboard behind her like an accusation. Her sandwich was turkey and Swiss on wheat bread. She'd prepared it that morning because her body required fuel, not because she wanted to eat. She placed both hands flat on the table to steady them, a technique learned in a surgical tent outside Baghdad where the floor shook from mortar impacts and the only thing that kept your hand steady was the knowledge that steadiness was the difference between life and death. She stared at the far wall where the paint peeled in long strips like skin. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she understood exactly what Sterling was doing. He wasn't just humiliating her, he was isolating her, turning her colleagues into witnesses to her incompetence, building social evidence that would support whatever came next. He was a competent villain, not a reckless one. He understood institutional power the way a conductor understands an orchestra. And Katie, sitting alone in an empty break room, suddenly understood that she'd activated something in him far more dangerous than anger. She'd activated his fear. 36 hours later, the radio crackled at 1847 hours. Code multi-vehicle collision, I-25 northbound, 6 patients incoming, 2 critical, ETA for minutes. The ER shifted immediately into the coordinated chaos that erupts when the city sends its broken to your doorstep. But today there was a problem. 2 nurses had called in sick, and the one attending physician scheduled for the trauma bay was currently shoulder-deep in a bowel perforation 3 floors up. The ED was running on a skeleton crew, 6 critical patients, for surgical bays, and mathematics that didn't work. Dr. Sterling moved through the ER like a man possessed, assigning staff with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Katie received her assignment without hesitation, monitoring vitals on stable patients, keeping her away from acute interventions, keeping her visible but powerless. She nodded once and moved to Bay 3, where a 17-year-old boy named Marcus Chen lay on the stretcher with chest trauma from a dashboard impact. The initial assessment was stable, blood pressure 110/70, heart rate 98, respirations normal, color good. Katie began her monitoring routine, checking the cardiac monitor every 90 seconds, documenting vitals on the chart, the invisible presence that kept the system moving. At minute 12, Marcus's blood pressure dropped to 85/50. Katie called for Sterling. He was 2 bays over, wrist deep in a shattered abdomen, his voice sharp and distant. "Stabilize him, I'm busy." 15 seconds later, the pressure plummeted to 70/40. Marcus gasped, his eyes wide with sudden fear, his skin shifting from healthy pink to the grey-white of someone whose blood had decided to relocate to somewhere it didn't belong. His jugular veins distended like cords, the unmistakable sign of pressure building inside his chest cavity. Katie recognized it with the certainty of someone who'd seen it before in a field surgical tent, recognized it in the way his lungs were struggling to expand, the way his oxygen saturation began its downward slide. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac. The heart being slowly suffocated by its own containment. He had maybe 2 minutes before complete collapse. The procedure was pericardiocentesis, a needle into the chest cavity through the subcostal approach, angled toward the left shoulder, guided by ultrasound to avoid the coronary arteries. But it required physician authorization, and Sterling was unavailable, and the on-call cardiologist was 20 minutes out, and Marcus Chen's blood pressure was now reading 65/38, which meant his heart was beating against a wall of accumulated blood, losing ground with every heartbeat. Katie looked through the glass partition separating the bays. Sterling's back was to her, his full attention on the abdomen in front of him, his hands moving with the confidence of a man who'd never entertained the possibility that he might be wrong about something. She looked back at Marcus, whose lips were taking on the blue-gray color of someone suffocating from the inside. His mother was screaming in the hallway behind security, the sound of her panic the only thing louder than the monitors. Katie pulled the ultrasound machine. She moved with a fluidity that came from muscle memory, from a dozen field surgeries in conditions that would have made any civilian surgeon weep, from years of making decisions under pressure because the alternative to deciding was watching people die. She prepped the needle kit, her hands moving with the precision of someone for whom this procedure wasn't a decision, it was simply the next necessary thing. She positioned the ultrasound probe on Marcus's chest, found the pericardial sac, identified the fluid collection with the practiced eye of someone who'd read ultrasound images in the dark by headlamp. The needle went in. Subcostal approach, angled toward the left shoulder, guided by the echo showing the exact location of the fluid, the exact angle that avoided the coronary arteries and the lung. Her hands didn't shake. They didn't hesitate. She drew back on the syringe, and dark blood flowed into the barrel, 120 cubic centimeters of accumulated blood that had been slowly crushing Marcus's heart. Marcus's blood pressure climbed, 90/55, then 105/65. Color returned to his face like someone waking from a nightmare. His breathing steadied. His mother's scream shifted from terror to relief, the difference between losing her son and keeping him the sound of 120 cubic centimeters of blood. Through the glass partition, Dr. Sterling turned. His hands froze in the middle of his procedure. His face drained of color, not with relief, but with the specific shade of rage that comes from witnessing your authority being disregarded by someone you'd already decided was subordinate to you. He watched Katie withdraw the needle, the syringe of blood in her hand, the ultrasound screen showing a decompressed pericardium, a boy who should have died breathing normally on a hospital stretcher. He didn't see a life saved. He saw insubordination. He saw a woman who decided for herself that protocol could be bent when bodies were on the line. He saw the thing he could never tolerate, someone proving that the rules he enforced so carefully were flexible when the stakes were real. Sterling set down his instruments. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Katie felt his stare like a weight, like the moment before something breaks. She secured the syringe, documented the procedure with clinical precision, checked Marcus's vitals one more time. The boy was stable. The boy was alive. But Katie understood, in that moment, that she'd just crossed a line from which there was no return. 48 hours after the ranger arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, the ambulance radio screamed through the emergency department like a hawk diving for prey. Multi-vehicle collision on I-25 near the Highlands exit. 6 patients inbound. 2 critical. ETA 8 minutes. Katie was restocking the trauma bays when the first alert went live across the overhead system. The fluorescent lights flickered as the ER shifted into overdrive, a choreography of chaos she performed in surgical tents under mortar fire. 2 nurses called in sick. 1 attending physician already committed to a post-operative bleed in the ICU. Dr. Sterling stood at the main console, jaw tight, reassigning staff with the efficiency of a man who'd managed crises before, just never one that would expose him. "Rodriguez, Bay 4, he said without looking at her. "Standard prep. Vitals monitoring only. Do not deviate." Katie nodded and moved, her hands already reaching for supplies before he finished speaking. "Bay 4. Trauma protocol. Stay in your lane." She understood the message beneath the words. After yesterday, when he'd watched her save the teenage boy's life, Sterling had barely spoken to her. Just a pointed stare through the glass partition, his expression darkening like a storm front moving inland. She'd felt the shift in the hospital's atmosphere immediately, the way staff moved around her differently now, careful, distant, as if she'd become something that required handling. The ambulances arrived in formation, sirens wailing like a funeral procession. 2 paramedics wheeled in an elderly man with a crushed leg, his face the color of old paper. A second stretcher carried a woman in her 50s with a bandaged head wound. The third brought a teenager, 14, maybe 15, with a chest that barely moved when he breathed. His blood pressure was already dropping. His O2 sat was sliding. Every monitor in the bay screamed the same message: compensation failing, shock deepening, time evaporating like water on hot asphalt. Dr. Sterling took the elderly man. The second attending grabbed the head wound. The teenager landed in Bay 4. With Katie. Alone. She'd known trauma bays in Baghdad with less equipment than this. She'd known villages with nothing but her own hands and bandages made from uniform cloth. The difference was training, not resources. The difference was knowing exactly what the body was trying to tell you when it started shutting down. "Get me a 14 gauge for 2 lines," she said to the med tech hovering in the doorway, her voice dropping half an octave. Not a question. Not a request. An order. The med tech moved. Continuous cardiac monitoring. "I need a 12-lead EKG in the next 30 seconds. The boy's eyes were wide, pupils blown, breath coming in shallow gasps. Cyanosis creeping around his fingertips. Blood pressure 88/52 and dropping. His chest wall had been compressed in the collision, the ribs fractured, the impact forcing fluid into the space between the heart and the pericardium. Cardiac tamponade. The heart was being compressed inside its own sac. Every beat was slower than the last. Every second he didn't decompress was a second closer to asystole. Katie's hands didn't hesitate. She'd done this before, not in a hospital, but in a field tent outside Fallujah with a Marine who'd taken shrapnel from a roadside IED. The principles were identical. Gravity, pressure, physiology. The body's laws didn't change based on geography or uniform. "Ultrasound to Bay 4, she called out. "Emergent." The ultrasound cart arrived within seconds. Katie ran the probe across his chest, her eyes reading the image with the precision of someone who'd read 1,000 of them. There it was, the black halo around the heart. Fluid accumulating. The chambers compressing with each beat, drowning in their own pericardial sac. 70 milliliters already. Maybe more. Maybe enough to kill him before the next minute ended. She didn't call for Dr. Sterling. She didn't page an attending. She moved to the bedside, her hands already reaching for the equipment she'd prepared in the seconds before recognizing what she was seeing. The sterile drape. The 18-gauge needle. The syringe. The same tool that had kept that Marine alive in 2009, the same movements her muscles remembered even though her mind had tried to bury them. "Talk to me," the med tech said, his voice tight with the knowledge that he was watching a nurse cross a line that shouldn't be crossable. Katie didn't answer. She felt the ribs beneath her fingertips, counting the spaces, second intercostal, third intercostal, fifth. The xiphoid process. Her mind was calculating angles and trajectories the way it always did when lives were measured in heartbeats. The needle advanced. The skin gave way. The needle advanced past the fascia. She felt the resistance change as the pericardium gave way. She felt the moment the needle entered the space where the fluid was suffocating this boy's heart. The syringe filled with blood the color of rust. 80 milliliters. Then 90. Then 120 milliliters of blood drawn from the space that was killing him. The monitor changed. The rhythm shifted. The blood pressure climbed, 70/40, then 78/45, then 82/50. The boy's eyes cleared slightly. His breathing deepened. The cyanosis retreated from his fingertips like a tide going out. He was alive. Katie removed the needle with the same precision that had guided it in. She secured the 4. She noted the time. She documented what she'd done with the clinical detachment of someone who'd filed hundreds of procedures under circumstances far worse than a perfectly equipped American trauma bay. It wasn't until she turned to check the monitor that she saw Dr. Sterling watching through the glass partition of Bay 4's wall. His procedure with the elderly man was complete. His hands were free. His eyes were locked on her with an expression that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with control, specifically, his loss of it. He watched for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned away and walked toward his office, his pace measured, his shoulders rigid beneath his white coat. Katie understood that look. She'd seen it before, on the faces of men who'd just realized they were standing next to someone operating at a level they hadn't anticipated. Men who'd never be comfortable with that knowledge. The boy lived. The monitors confirmed it. His blood pressure stabilized at 92/58, climbing steadily toward something sustainable. His O2 sat rose to 96%. A proper EKG showed normal sinus rhythm, the heart beating as if the last 5 minutes hadn't been a descent into organ failure. Katie finished her documentation and stepped back from the bedside. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But her mind was already following Dr. Sterling's trajectory toward his office, already understanding that he was making calls. Within the hour, she saw him on the phone behind his closed door. His jaw was moving. His free hand was gesturing, sharp, aggressive. He was a man accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. A man who'd built his authority on the assumption that nurses stayed in their lane and doctors made the decisions. Katie had just demonstrated that someone in his department could make life-or-death decisions with the kind of authority that couldn't be dismissed as luck or instinct. She returned to the nurse's station and opened her email. A message had arrived at 6:48 p.m., 23 minutes ago. Report to HR at 0800 tomorrow. Bring your nursing license and employment records. The sender was listed as Hospital Compliance, Dr. Sterling, recommending physician. Katie stared at the screen. Her shift was supposed to end at 7. It was now 6:54 p.m. She had 14 hours until the meeting that would determine whether her quiet life ended the way she'd always feared it would, not with violence, but with bureaucracy. She'd walked away from the Navy when the screaming stopped being containable. When the PTSD became less like a memory and more like a permanent resident in her nervous system. She'd chosen Denver because it was far enough from the coast, far enough from anyone who might recognize her. She'd chosen a nursing job at a small hospital because it was quiet, unremarkable, a place where a woman with a military background could disappear into routine. Her credentials were real. Her nursing license was valid. But it was dated only 2 years back, and before that, before the discharge, before the medical separation, before the paperwork that officially dissolved her service, there was a gap. A void. The Navy didn't advertise when it lost people to their own trauma. The medical discharge was confidential. The veterans' transition resources were private. Katie drove to her apartment in Denver's Highland neighborhood, a small one-bedroom she'd rented month to month for 18 months, paying in cash when possible. The rain had started again, the kind of cold November rain that made the city feel smaller, more isolated. She parked in the back lot, climbed the stairs, and opened the door to silence. The closet was in the back bedroom, the one she used as a study. She'd kept the door locked, which was unnecessary. Her son Miguel wasn't old enough to break a simple lock, and even if he'd wanted to, he respected her privacy in the way kids do when they sense that some things are broken and shouldn't be touched. She knelt on the closet floor and moved the winter jackets. Behind them, pushed to the back corner, was the shadow box. Walnut frame. Glass front. Inside, 2 bronze stars, arranged in ascending order. A purple heart with its ribbon. Photographs she'd never framed, pressed against the back panel. And the medals that took up the most space, the ones she'd never expected to earn, the ones that represented something she'd tried desperately to leave behind. Katie's fingers pressed against the glass. She didn't open it. She'd learned, a long time ago, that opening certain things let the ghosts out, and ghosts were harder to catch when they'd been loose too long. Tomorrow at 8 in the morning, Dr. Sterling's investigation would begin. Tomorrow, she would walk into a room with people who had already decided what they wanted to find. Tomorrow, she would either disappear quietly or burn everything down. But tonight, she held the shadow box against her chest and let the rain hammer against the windows like Morse code, each drop a word in a language she'd promised herself she'd never speak again. The morning after Katie sits in her kitchen with tears she can't explain to her son, Dr. Sterling arrives at Oak Creek Memorial with the quiet confidence of a man holding all the cards. He'd spent the night making phone calls, systematic, deliberate calls to board members he'd cultivated over 15 years of navigating hospital politics with the precision of a chess grandmaster. His voice on those calls was measured, professional, concerned. "I have significant concerns about credential verification in our trauma department. We may have a liability issue." The board members listened. They always did. Sterling had helped 3 of them navigate malpractice suits. He'd recommended the attorney who'd saved another's daughter from a DUI conviction. These weren't favors owed in the abstract, they were measured in years of accumulated goodwill, and he was calling them all in. By 8 o'clock, he'd already reached out to the references Katie had listed on her employment application. The calls went to phone numbers that no longer worked, addresses that led nowhere, people who'd left no forwarding information. It was exactly what he'd expected. Her civilian credentials were a ghost town, a carefully constructed disappearance designed to hide exactly what Sterling had already deduced: this woman wasn't who she claimed to be. The gaps in her employment history before Oak Creek Memorial created the perfect narrative of falsification. A nursing degree without verifiable attendance. References that evaporated. A hire made 18 months ago with incomplete background screening. Sterling smiled as he hung up the phone. The truth didn't matter anymore. The appearance of truth was enough. He convened an emergency investigative review for 9:15 that morning, a move that required only his request and the hospital attorney's signature. He personally selected the investigator, a compliance consultant named Richard Morse who'd worked 3 previous cases for Sterling's recommendations and understood the unspoken expectation: this investigation would find what Sterling needed it to find. Morse was competent enough to make the conclusions look legitimate, malleable enough to understand that his professional reputation depended on Sterling's future business. The outside investigator. The neutral third party. The facade of impartiality. By 9 o'clock, Katie sat in a windowless HR conference room on the 3rd floor of Oak Creek Memorial, fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of institutional indifference. The table was laminate. The chairs were ergonomic but uncomfortable. Across from her sat Dr. Sterling with his arms folded across his chest, the compliance investigator Morse with a folder that looked thicker than it should have been, and the hospital attorney whose name was Patricia Voss and whose expression suggested she'd already made her decision before anyone entered the room. Katie's hands rested on the table, steady, her face composed with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen worse things than a termination meeting in a box-shaped room. Morse slid the folder across the laminate surface. His voice was sympathetic, which made it worse. we've attempted to verify your nursing credentials. Multiple references are unreachable. Your employment history before Oak Creek Memorial is inconsistent. Your stated nursing school has no record of attendance under your name prior to 2 years ago. Can you explain the gaps? Katie's breath came steady. 1 measured inhale. 1 measured exhale. Her voice was quiet, not meek, quiet like a person with nothing left to prove. I can provide my license verification and current certification records. The gaps are personal. Sterling leaned forward, his voice carrying the paternal disappointment of an authority figure confronting insubordination. Personal doesn't cut it when you're performing procedures reserved for physicians. That pericardiocentesis on the teenager was felony-level scope creep. We have a duty to ensure our staff are who they claim to be. I saved his life, Katie said. Not defensive. Not pleading. Factual. The pressure tamponade would have arrested his heart in 4 minutes. You were occupied with another patient. You don't get to make that decision unilaterally, Sterling said, his jaw tightening. That's the entire point. Voss, the attorney, slid a printed letter across the table with the efficiency of someone performing a ritual she'd performed many times before, without verifiable references and given the repeated protocol violations documented in your personnel file. The hospital is recommending immediate termination effective immediately. You'll receive severance in accordance with your contract. Security will escort you from the building. Morse continued, his tone maintaining that frustrating sympathy. You're being terminated for repeated protocol violations and inability to verify credentials prior to employment. This creates significant liability for the hospital. I'm sure you understand. Katie stared at the letter. The words moved across the page like print on a screen that no longer belonged to her. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She simply nodded, once, and stood. I'll need to collect my belongings. By 9:45, Katie walked through the ER corridor of Oak Creek Memorial for the last time, a cardboard box resting against her hip. Inside it, her stethoscope wrapped in a spare pair of scrubs, the leather keychain with the small Navy insignia, the photograph of Miguel from last summer where he's not yet 14 and doesn't understand that his mother was once someone else entirely. The nurses at the station who'd avoided her eyes for the past 2 days refused to meet her gaze now. Their silence was a chorus. The ranger watched from his hospital bed, the one she'd stitched together with the hand motions of muscle memory, and his fists clenched on the blanket in helpless fury. Sterling stood at the far end of the corridor, arms crossed, his expression suggesting he'd already moved on to the next crisis, the next problem, the next person whose competence threatened his equilibrium. Dennis, the security guard, walked beside her to the parking lot. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who'd always greeted her by name, who'd held doors and asked about her shift. Now he couldn't look at her. His face was apologetic but helpless, the look of a person who understands his following orders he disagrees with but has no power to refuse them. The rain had started again, that peculiar Denver rain that comes and goes like a sigh. It hammered the parking lot as they walked, each drop a percussion instrument in a symphony of ending. Katie drove home in silence, still wearing her scrubs, the cardboard box on the passenger seat. The drive took 23 minutes. She counted the traffic lights. She counted the breaths. She did not count the ways her life had just been erased. That evening, Miguel found her at the kitchen table. He was 14, rail-thin, with her dark eyes and his father's stubborn jawline. He asked, "Mom, why are you home early?" His voice carried the assumption that the world operated in expected patterns, that people worked their shifts and came home at the scheduled time, that nothing fundamental had shifted in the 4 hours she'd been gone. Katie looked at her son across the table and found she couldn't speak. For the first time in 18 months, tears came. Not theatrical tears. Not the kind of crying that comes with sound. Just water moving down her face, silent and inevitable as rain. She'd survived 2 combat tours. She'd held arterial bleeds with her bare hands. She'd buried her identity in the soil of Denver and built a new one from documentation and silence. She'd held it all together, the secret, the past, the medals locked in a shadow box on the shelf, the unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, held it all so carefully that no one would have to know who she really was. And now her son was asking her why she was home early, and she couldn't find the words to explain that the woman he knew had just been erased by a man in a hospital who decided that competence was insubordination, and that sometimes the price of saving a life is losing everything else. Miguel pulled his chair closer. He'd never seen her cry. She'd never let him see that. He wrapped his thin 14-year-old arms around her shoulders and held on, and Katie, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, who'd been trained by the United States Navy to survive things that would break most people, let herself be held by her son and said nothing at all. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even the beginning of what was about to happen. Miguel walked through the Oak Creek Memorial lobby the next morning with his mother's shadow box clutched against his chest like a shield. 14 years old, shoulders squared, moving with the same controlled precision Katie had trained into him without words. He didn't ask for directions. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward the elevator marked for administration, past nurses who recognized him from yesterday's parking lot vigil, past the information desk, toward the conference room where the board was gathering for their emergency session. The door was closed. Miguel opened it anyway. 16 faces turned. Board members in dark suits. Dr. Marsh, the chief of surgery, mid-sentence. Dr. Sterling in a corner chair, his tie already loosened, his face the color of wet concrete. And then Captain Hendricks on the conference phone speaker, his voice filling the room, "We're all on the line. Let's hear what the kid has to say." Miguel's voice shook but never cracked. "My Monsignor Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. United States Navy. They need to see these." He opened the shadow box. An attending nurse took the frame with trembling hands. The kind of trembling that comes not from weakness but from suddenly understanding the magnitude of what she'd been missing. She read aloud, voice steady, Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire. Combat Medicine. Baghdad, 2009. A pause. She turned the frame. Second Bronze Star. Surgical intervention during active engagement. Baghdad, 2010. Her breath caught. Purple Heart. 2 of them. Medical evacuation. Complications from combat injuries sustained in the line of duty. The room did not go silent. It did something worse than silence, it held its breath. The Army Ranger, Staff Sergeant Daniels, sat upright in his hospital bed 3 floors down, his phone pressed to his ear. He'd made the call at dawn, before the nurses could stop him. He'd dialed a number he'd memorized 8 years ago and never forgotten. When the voice answered, gravel and command, a voice that had ordered men through breaches under fire, he'd said only, "Sir, it's Daniels." "Bravo platoon." "The nurse at Oak Creek. She's being terminated. She saved a kid's life. They're destroying her." Captain James Hendricks had listened to everything, asked 3 questions, then hung up and started making his own calls. Now Hendricks' voice came through the speaker, and every word landed like a boot on concrete. Senior Chief Rodriguez performed a pericardiocentesis on a 14-year-old in cardiac tamponade. Withdrawn 120 milliliters of fluid. Restored blood pressure. Saved that child's life. That's textbook emergency medicine, and it's exactly the kind of surgical decision-making that kept my soldiers alive in the Sanjin Valley. A pause. Metal hard pause. In 2011, during Operation Enduring Freedom, outside Baghdad, Senior Chief Rodriguez treated 14 casualties in 60 minutes. 14. In a tent with incoming fire. She saved 18 lives in a single engagement. Some of those soldiers are sitting in living rooms right now, teaching their kids to ride bikes, because of her. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the table edge. Hendricks continued, she was nominated for the Navy Cross for that engagement. She refused it. Said the men deserved it more. I've commanded a lot of sailors. I've buried some too. The ones still breathing, they breathed because Katie Rodriguez knew how to move under pressure. How to make decisions when everything's falling apart. How to save lives when the rules don't matter anymore. The speaker crackled. And I'm reading here that your hospital fired her for following the exact protocol she learned keeping my people alive. The board chair, Dr. Patricia Marsh, 63 years old, 31 years at Oak Creek, turned her head toward Sterling. Dr. Sterling, did you know any of this when you initiated the termination? Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. No sound emerged. Miguel stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the room. My mom wears a faded unit patch inside her jacket. She's had it since Baghdad. She never told me what it meant. I just knew she slept with it on her nightstand. She never talked about the Navy. She never wanted the attention. She just wanted to be a nurse. His eyes found Sterling. You called her clipboard Katie. Like it was an insult. Like working quietly and doing your job right was something to mock. Vance Clayton stood. The Rangers' former commanding officer, visiting from Colorado Springs, his uniform creased like a knife blade, his presence in that room like a predator recognizing a weaker animal. He'd driven to Denver the moment Hendricks called. He moved closer to Sterling, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of low that makes muscles tense. You tried to destroy her. For doing exactly what she was trained to do. Agent Sarah Kress from the FBI's Denver field office checked her notes. She'd been invited because Katie's termination had triggered federal flags, veterans with service-related PTSD protections, privacy statutes regarding civilian reinvention, retaliation protocols. This termination will be under review. Retaliation against protected veterans is a federal matter. We'll be conducting interviews. Sterling's face flushed, veins standing out on his neck like a roadmap to panic. His voice came out hoarse. You can't, I've been here 15 years. I built this trauma program. I've trained. Dr. Marsh raised her hand. Just raised it. The gesture of someone who'd spent 30 years deciding who stayed and who left. You built this program on the backs of nurses you belittled. How many others did we lose because you made them feel worthless? How many potential lives didn't get saved because talented people walked away from medicine because of you? She nodded toward the door. Dennis, the same security guard who'd handed Katie her cardboard box yesterday afternoon, stepped into the conference room. He'd been waiting in the hallway. He held an identical box, white, ordinary, the kind of box that carries the weight of a career imploding. His voice was quiet but clear, the voice of a man who'd seen this before and knew exactly what it meant. Dr. Sterling, I believe you know the way out. Sterling stared at the box. At Dennis. At the shadow box on the table, at the medals visible even from across the room, at Miguel's face, a 14-year-old boy who'd just ended his career with nothing but the truth. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. He took the box with shaking hands, his face ashen like someone watching themselves disappear, and walked out in silence. The sound of the closing door was almost gentle. But that wasn't the worst part for Sterling. The worst part was the waiting. The calls that didn't come. The colleagues who'd suddenly forgotten his cell phone number. The hospital board suspension notice, then the termination for gross misconduct, failure of duty, and retaliation against protected personnel. The medical licensing board's investigation. The loss of his admitting privileges at every hospital in the Denver metro area, one call from the chief of surgery to a colleague, one conversation about competence and character, and suddenly his network collapsed like a house made of playing cards. Within 6 months, Dr. Sterling would be teaching CPR certification classes to bored adults in a strip mall community center for $14 an hour, watching students eye-roll his corrections, his medical degree hanging on the wall of a walk-in clinic that would eventually terminate him too for philosophical differences. Miguel collapsed into a chair, his shoulders shaking. Not from weakness. From release. From finally not having to carry alone whatever burden Katie had been carrying in silence for so many years. The ranger, still wearing the hospital gown, still healing from the stab wound that had nearly killed him, crossed the room and placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder. Your mom's a hero, kid. Don't let anyone tell you different. I've served with 214 Marines. None of them move the way she moves. None of them think the way she thinks. He paused. She saved my life, and she saved that boy's life, and probably 10 others I'll never know about. That's what a hero looks like. The board members began the process of moving toward resolution: Katie's immediate reinstatement, back pay, a formal apology on the record, and something more, an offer to design and direct a new trauma fellowship program focused on non-traditional pathways into emergency medicine. Because they'd just realized something Oak Creek Memorial had been missing. They'd been building a hospital on the backs of invisible people. And sometimes the invisible people were the strongest ones in the building. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez stood in her new office on the 3rd floor of Oak Creek Memorial. The door placard read, "Director, Trauma Fellowship Program." Her shadow box hung on the wall beside her diplomas and certifications, finally displayed without shame. Next to it, the Army Ranger's dog tags in a frame, returned to her with a handwritten note on thick paper: "You taught me what real rank looks like. Thank you for my life. SFC Daniels." Katie wore scrubs with her name embroidered above the pocket, not hidden, not disguised, not disappearing into the background. She was visible now. Her limp, the result of a blast injury in Kandahar, was no longer something she compensated for in silence. It was simply part of who she was. Miguel did his homework in the corner chair, waiting for her day shift to end so they could drive home together, talking about normal things: school, friends, whether they should get pizza or Korean food for dinner. The Ranger visited with his wife and daughters, all of them alive because of 30 seconds of perfect surgical decision-making. He shook Katie's hand with his full strength, no longer careful, no longer protecting an injury. "The protocol you designed for emergency medical intervention is being adopted by 3 other hospitals. You're changing how we train people to save lives." Katie smiled, the first smile in years that reached all the way to her eyes. "We train them to save lives, not follow hierarchy." Across Denver, in a strip mall community center next to a tax preparation office and a failing frozen yogurt shop, Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification to 15 students who didn't know who he was and wouldn't have cared. He showed a woman how to place her hands for chest compressions, 40 compressions per minute, hard enough to crack ribs. "That's how you know you're doing it right." And when she rolled her eyes and muttered, "Whatever," he said nothing. He'd learned to say nothing. He'd learned what it felt like to be invisible. At Oak Creek Memorial, the new chief of surgery, Dr. Petal, a trauma surgeon trained in Kandahar herself, implemented every protocol Katie had designed. Nurses were empowered to perform life-saving interventions in genuine emergencies, with proper training and oversight, without waiting for physician approval. The break room disciplinary board was gone, replaced by a commendation wall where Katie's name appeared first, for exceptional courage, clinical excellence, and the lives she saved in silence. Katie stood at the window of her office at sunset, the Rocky Mountains turning purple in the distance, Miguel's voice behind her asking about dinner. She touched the dog tags on the wall, the metal cool under her fingers, and thought about the people she'd lost in Baghdad. The people she'd saved. The people she'd never get to tell. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever carried a secret that could change everything, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this in the comments. What would you have done in Katie's position? What would you have risked to protect your truth? Let's hear your story in the comments below.